Well, hello, everyone. We are very fortunate to be able to welcome to our summit Dr. Kenneth Peltier. Dr. Peltier is a professor of medicine in the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. He also has faculty appointments in the Department of Psychiatry, as well as the Department of Family and Community Medicine. He's also the director of what is called the Corporate Health Improvement Program, which is a large research collaboration between the center that he directs and many of the Fortune 500 companies, including Ford and IBM and Prudential and Oracle. And he also works very closely in this capacity with NASA and the Mayo Clinic. And he's also serves as chairman of the American Health Association. Really a pleasure to have you here today, Ken. And I think our listeners through the course of our conversation will come to appreciate how much not only of a pioneer you've been in what is currently called integrative health, and many years ago was initially called whole person medicine and alternative medicine. But in addition to that, you've been really fundamental in helping us guide our understanding of the importance of mind as fundamental to our healing. And that is where I want to begin our conversation today, is to speak about the mind, because as you've written repeatedly and spoken about repeatedly, the mind is really the foundational piece to our healing. It can either drive us and support us to healing and well-being, or as you had eloquently noted in your book, that the mind can be both a healer as well as slayer. And I love that title. And I remember I read that you had some challenges initially with the publishers. I didn't want you to keep that title, but you managed to keep it because it was so descriptive of what the mind can do for us. And then later, as you know, you followed up with another book titled Sound Mind, Sound Body, again, emphasizing the body. So I want to ask you to get started. Where did your deep insights about the nature of the mind for our healing come from? Certainly you didn't pick it up in early medical school, because this was not on the radar then. You found it somewhere, and that started your trajectory, which you've continued today.
Well, thank you. It's great to talk with you. I admire your work, and this is a real pleasure. I've been looking forward to this. Bit of a long-winded answer to your question, I'm afraid. I took a year off, and I traveled around Europe, and I found myself on a Greek island, Tinos, Tinos. And Tinos is like Lourdes for the Christians. It's the island of miracles for the Greek Orthodox. And while I was there were pilgrims who came to that island, and they made this procession up to a little chapel. And you would see people who had limb deformities, extreme pain, people who couldn't walk. And they would come out, they'd be walking, they'd be flexible, they'd be happy. I don't know what the outcome was, but at least for a period of time, they overcame these extreme disabilities. And that wasn't what I learned in medical school. So I wondered, what is that? So when I came back to UCSF, there was some research that had been conducted by Dr. Elma Green at the Menninger Foundation. And he had studied some meditators with the ability to control bleeding and pain. But they hadn't been done under very controlled circumstances, and they were dismissed. And again, this is the mid-1970s. And as you know, there was a great controversy over whether people could ever influence consciously the autonomic nervous system. So I decided that what I would do is study a group of adept meditators under controlled laboratory conditions, and we monitored blood pressure and heart rate and cardiotachometer and respiration patterns, EEG, everything we could measure in the mid-1970s. And in fact, we had a series of adept meditators come through our lab, and they would do things like skewer their bicep with a large diameter unsterilized knitting needle. And when they were meditating, it was as though they were on a beach relaxing. And we had tried beforehand to say, do they feel pain? Do they bleed normally? And establish that very clearly. So that to me was the first aha, which is if these individuals through meditation, through practice, and again, emphasized through practice. This is a do not do this at home admonition.
Yeah.
We're able to overcome bleeding, overcome pain, overcome infection to an astounding degree, and repeat it over time. We had 7 or 8 individuals. So this told me now there's something about the mind body where it's not that mind over matter, it's that mind does matter, is what I ended up concluding.
Wonderful. I love that. And as I'm starting to think about what you're speaking to us and sharing, and the whole purpose of this Summit for Healing, for me, it brings up the question, and we'll get to your more recent book in a moment because it's relevant. But so, I mean, how much practice, how much of an adept do we as individuals have to be to gain the benefits of having a healing mind? Do I have to have meditated for 20 years before something clicks on? Or can I, as more of a novice, perhaps I started meditating a month ago or 2 months ago? I think the answer is immediately the effect is there, but can you speak about that also from your insights and your work?
Well, that's an excellent question. And you're right, the effects are immediate. It doesn't take years and decades. I mean, these individuals that we studied, in fact, have practiced for decades, but then again, they're doing something that none of us are ever going to do. I mean, I prick myself with a needle and it's terrible. So we're not going to do that. But there are a number of studies, 2 in particular, one at Harvard that looked at adept meditators, people that had simply practiced, I think, for 6 months, and they had practiced mindfulness meditation. And they looked at, did these individuals after 12 weeks have a positive impact on their epigenetic expression? So reduction in inflammation, increased in oxygenation to their cells. And they found, yes, all of these parameters changed in a positive direction. And then there was one smart alecky graduate student who decided he wanted to see how quickly this could happen. So he actually took a group of people that had not meditated and a group of people who did, and he monitored the change over 15 minutes of meditation. And what he found is that individuals with any degree of experience after 15 minutes produce these profound changes in their epigenetic profile. Now, it doesn't mean we can meditate for 15 minutes and all is well, but it does mean, as you point out, a mind-body interaction happens in a matter of seconds, a matter of minutes. And what we see over time is that the maximum amount of time it takes to completely restructure our mind-body system, our diet, our et cetera, is 10 to 12 weeks. So we're not talking about a huge commitment of effort or time.
Thank you for that particular insight. That provides confidence, I think, to myself certainly, as well as listeners of this summit, because it gives us insight into that power of the mind to provide really, frankly, instantaneous healing and to guide us on a new direction. And that really brings me to the topic of your more recent book, which I'm going to read the title, Change Your Genes, Change Your Life, Optimal Health with the New Science of Epigenetics. And this is so highly relevant to what we've been speaking about so far because, well, in addition to the mind, I know you'll speak about the environment as well. But can you tell us about epigenetics and why it's considered the new science of genetics?
Well, one reviewer quipped that Mind is Healer, Mind is Slayer I wrote in 1977. And one of the reviewers said, well, it's like an update at the biochemical and genetic level of Mind is Healer. And it's true. So what we're doing is we're seeing the effects of mental influences at the cellular level of the DNA, which is, to me, astounding. It's not something I expect, not something I had ever learned. And epigenetics is simply, epi means above, around, or above, surrounding. So epigenetics are all of the influences that impact the gene beyond the gene itself. And the book title is a bit of a gotcha. For Change Your Genes. Genes, in fact, do not change. They can be damaged by radiation. They can be damaged by petrochemicals like glyphosate. in Monsanto's Roundup, the extremely carcinogenic agent. So the DNA can be damaged, but it in fact never changes. What does change is its expression. So you may have a predisposition to something both positive and negative, and whether or not that becomes expressed or not is dependent on how you manage stress, diet, the environment, physical activity, psychosocial changes, pharmacology. And I guess the last point I would make about that is less than 5% of what we exhibit as adults is due to a monogenic or fully penetrant genetic predisposition. So that, and most of those are neurological conditions that show up within the first 18 to 24 months. If you have that gene, that disease will show up. Other than that, 95% of what we experience in health, mental attributes, longevity, how long we will live, is entirely dependent on what we do.
Thank you. So the epigenetic side, there's the thinking you just spoke about, and we were thinking about a little bit earlier with the meditation, the environmental side too. I'm pleased you mentioned the glyphosate. I've done some research on that, and it was one of my questions for you. And in a lecture you had given a couple of years ago, you spoke about the 7 pillars of health, and one was detoxification. And when I read that, my mind went to a lot of these so-called xenobiotics, in addition to glyphosate, amongst many other herbicides and pesticides. It's easy to get caught up and mixed up in how is the best way for us to detoxify, because we do need to be mindful of what we are being exposed to in the environment. Yes, partly the air, partly the water we drink, but certainly the foods. Can you provide us some guidance and recommendations and resources really for detoxification guidelines that are really things that we could practically do and that are safe to do?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And glyphosate in particular is pervasive. There was a study 2 months ago where they looked at single-celled organisms in the Antarctic Ocean. And what they found is that every single single-cell organism in the Antarctic Ocean had traces of glyphosate. So we have literally poisoned the planet with a chemical that is identified as a known carcinogen by the World Health Organization, and the Food and Drug Administration has failed to do so, but that's political and has nothing to do with science. As far as detoxification, the liver is our primary organ of detoxification. And one of the things that we can do, practically speaking, is there is really excellent research on milk thistle as an additive or a supplement that can aid the liver to detoxify, that can activate the cytochrome P450 cycle and detoxify of things like glyphosate, of the toxins in food, of which there are many. The other are eating foods that have one of the mechanisms whereby the poisons, if you will, become active is through inflammation. And excessive inflammation of the liver and non-fatty liver disease and other kinds of conditions is due to the fact that our diets have a high predisposition to inflammation. So white sugar, white flour, processed meats in general have a high inflammatory index. So if we're eating in a way that is non-inflammatory, so we're eating fruits and vegetables, having sources of protein like lentil and rice, fish, those kinds of things all, again, reduce inflammation, enhance detoxification, and are all the practical steps we can take to basically ensure that we have a healthy internal environment, even though most of us, unfortunately, are often in a very unhealthy external or dietary environment.
Yes, thank you. I want to also mention for the attendees of the summit that there are quite a number of articles out there now that if I say tomorrow switch to a purely organic diet, within about 3 or 4 days, the glyphosate that my body has been exposed to with the diet will slowly be excreted out of the body, and about by the 4th or 5th day, there'll be no traces left of it in my urine or in my blood. So that's the power of just switching immediately to an organic diet. Then there are other considerations, as you're saying, to help get it out of tissue where it might be embedded. But there are mechanisms to do that too.
Absolutely.
Yes. A question back on the epigenetics. So we've spoken about the diet, and you mentioned things like sugars and extra fats, and then when we're speaking about the environment. Back to the mind and concepts around stress, and we spoke of meditation earlier. Are there different forms of meditation that you are more partial to as far as the potential for influencing our epigenetics in our body? Or is it really just important to find for the person the proper form of meditation that fits for you, that you're being more willing to adhere and do on a regular basis?
The latter.
The latter.
As you know, there are hundreds of
Yeah.
forms of meditation. Some have been well studied. Zazen, transcendental meditation, mindfulness have been well studied, but there are a virtually infinite number of meditation and yogic practices, all of which have a beneficial effect. There's no question about that. But the point that you've hit on, I think, is really critical. When I have individuals that ask, what should I do for meditation? I ask them, all of us have something we do that enables us to manage stress. It might be to listen to music. It might be to take a walk outside. It might be to hum a tune, to recite a syllable or a prayer or a favorite phrase. It honestly, it does not matter what it is. But the challenge is to ask yourself, what single thing do I do when I'm under stress that enables me to change from a chronic, debilitating, negative, destructive stress to a short-term, manageable, pleasurable, stressful event, and then find a system of meditation that helps you to enhance that. And you will. If it's music, you'll find that. If it's breathing, there's certainly, many forms of meditation emphasize breathing. So the first question is, what do you do? And then how do you enhance that through practice?
Excellent. You mentioned going out and taking a walk. That brought to my mind the value of exercise, certainly, which on one hand, yes, physical activity, physical fitness helps for the stress in the mind, but also there's the fitness side of it independent of that. Has there been work on how does just staying at least relatively physically fit have favorable effects on our epigenetics, our gene expression for our health?
Yeah, there are actually a number of good studies. There was one study conducted out of the University of Wales in Cork. And what they looked at was a group of rugby players, 40 rugby players, and compared them to 40 basically amateur athletes. And they looked at their ability to influence and have an optimal immune response, the epigenetic response. And what they found is that the athletes who were rugby players had a much more intact, robust, healthy response in their epigenetic system, both in terms of health maintenance and life expectancy. For the amateur athletes who didn't do very much or couch potatoes or whatever, they had a very impaired immune response. They had higher incidence of colds and flus, minor illnesses, predispositions of things like cancer and inflammation. So the physical activity has a direct positive impact on the genetic expression. It's not difficult to think about because the gene is inside a cell. The cell is like an ocean of biochemical influences. So everything we do, exercise, has a profound impact on cellular mechanisms, meditation, diet, environmental exposures, all the things we've been talking about all affect that environmental ocean of the cell, and therefore in turn has a direct impact on the gene expression.
I like that phrase, the environmental ocean of the cell. It is like a planet unto itself, isn't it?
Yes, it quite literally is. And the mechanism is around each gene are things called single nucleotide polymorphisms, like all things in genetics, it's a mouthful, but SNPs for short. And they're like rheostats. And they govern whether a gene is turned on or turned off, the intensity of the light or diminishing the light. And those SNPs are literally susceptible to every biochemical change in that environmental ocean within the cell, and the cell within the body, and the body within organisms. So I think it's an easy causal chain to begin to link extreme and external circumstances down to the very, very cellular level of gene expression.
Yes, yeah. So you mentioned the rugby players, and of course they're incredibly fit specimens in a category unto themselves. Many of us who exercise don't exercise to that degree routinely. So it brings to mind for me a question we had similar to meditation a few minutes ago, where, well, we could be more beginning meditators, or could be highly advanced monks who have had 10,000 plus, 50,000 plus hours of practice. I know that even a little bit of physical activity is beneficial, but is there a threshold too for the epigenetics phenomenon where some more minimal amount of physical activity, fitness would be needed to begin to glean those health benefits for my body, my health?
As with meditation, the answer again is yes. And generally, what the research points out is that roughly 15 minutes and preferably interval training, so the raising your heart rate and keeping it at a certain level and dropping off, turns out to be not as efficient in terms of establishing the aerobic capacity of the body. So if you do, say, heavy exertion for 5 minutes, cool down for 5 minutes, heavy exertion for 5 minutes, and do that for 15 or 20 minutes, 2 or 3 times a week, that is an adequate amount of exercise to produce the effects that we're talking about. Even walking, if you're doing brisk walking and you do that more or less on a daily basis, and that can be 15 to 30 minutes, again, that has a salutary positive impact on all of our epigenetic expression. So it does not require a heroic level of exertion. It's good news for me to derive these benefits.
Yeah, for me too. And, I was also thinking about the side of being physically fit, just the greater clarity of mind, of course, which influences the susceptibility, vulnerability to stress, but also people who are more physically fit, their meditation experiences when they sit to close their eyes, be it for a 15-minute meditation, a half hour, whatever their routine is, the meditation is much clearer, I'd say. So the benefits we can glean from the meditation side of our practices are enhanced when we are more physically fit, certainly also when we have a more favorable diet for our health and well-being. I mean, isn't that indeed partly the purpose of traditional whole medical systems, where we were simultaneously prescribed multiple things to do for our collective well-being, not just focusing on one treatment for one symptom, such as, you know, the other term, an ill for a pill. But that's the beauty, I think, of whole person medicine, which has evolved fairly well, I think, here in the West. It's still coming along. I'd like to get to that a little bit later.
I agree with that, by the way. Yeah.
Good. So NASA, I'm anxious to hear what you have to say about NASA and epigenetics. I know there were the twins. One stayed on Earth, one went up and rotated around the Earth in a space station for a long time, I think approximately a year.
Yes.
What did that particular study tell us about epigenetics that's really relevant also for us here who reside on Earth full time?
Well, it may be surprising, but NASA actually has one of the largest databases on twin studies of epigenetic expression. Now, I'll get to why that is, but it always seems surprising. Why is NASA interested in epigenetics? Well, in 2018, the particular study you're referring to was Scott Kelly, was in orbit for nearly a year at the International Space Station. And he has a brother, Mark, who is also an astronaut. So you have twins, they're astronauts. One was in space for a year and the other was not. And they each had epigenetic profiles before and after that 1 year. And when Scott returned to Earth, they found something very surprising, which is 7% of his epigenetic expression had changed. Now, 7% may sound like a lot or a little, but consider the baseline. The genetic expression that separates humans from chimpanzees is about 1%. So a 7% change in less than a year is astounding. And these were major things like changes in cellular replication, immunology, immunity. And this was really quite amazing. They repeated the study 6 months later, and they found that of the 7% that had changed, 4% remained unchanged. Therein lies the reason why NASA is so concerned about this. We do not know. What does that 4% mean? Is it permanent? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is he become susceptible to diseases that we don't know about? Or is it increased his IQ? And the reason why this particular area is of such great focus for NASA is that if you think about a mission to Mars, that might be a 2-year mission. So the question is, by the time a crew of a shuttle reaches Mars, are they a different species? Has their genetic endowment so profoundly changed on the order of 7% or more? Do they become a different species? Is the subsequent generation Martian or human? I mean, it's a bit of a preposterous question, but it's real. And we see that in the study of genetics. You know, some of the twin studies have been actually the most fascinating ones. If you have, as a sidebar, in 2012, Bert Vogelstein, who's one of the most cited authors in the world, I think he's in the top 10 cited authors for his work in genetic replication, did a study of thousands. I think the number was 7,000 twins from a Scandinavian database and other databases. And he followed these sets of twins for 24 conditions over 15 years. And the prediction was that if one twin had a particular illness or disease, the other twin would as well. That's the logical conclusion if you have a genetic deterministic model. And what he found out is that was not at all the case, not at all. What he found that if one twin had Parkinson's, the identical twin had a less than 5% likelihood of manifesting Parkinson's. For heart disease, it was about 50-50. If one twin had heart disease, the likelihood of the other one having heart disease was about 50%. For most cancers, it was less than 40%. So what we see is that in genetically identical twins is the huge power of the changes that happen to us after birth and in the course of our lifetime, the course of all the habits that we've been discussing. Very powerful.
Indeed. I love the findings you're sharing with us, that the lessons there emphasize again and again, all the books we've mentioned that you've done so far. The 7% epigenetic change in the astronaut, was that due to stress of being up in orbit? Or was it not being in such close proximity to the electromagnetic field of the Earth? Is there an understanding of what caused that?
It's probably multifactorial. Their speculation was that zero gravity, a profoundly altered diet, lack of contact with intimate relatives and friends, the lack of physical activity that you would have on the Earth, all of those variables. So the genes are always operating in a very, very complex matrix, interacting with other genes, interacting with all of the psychosocial determinants we've been talking about. So each of those influences clearly had an impact on that astronaut's genetic expression. And the fact that they regressed in about 6 months to some degree, 3% regressed. But to me, the fascinating thing is 4% did not. That is really quite astounding and also rather alarming.
I imagine all these influences, putting, say, gravity aside, but for those of us here on Earth all the time so far, the thoughts, the mind, the environment side, and I want to bring up feelings in a moment, but does that equation about which is influencing me might be different than another person? Maybe I'm more susceptible, let's say, vulnerable to negative thoughts and rumination than my neighbor here. Maybe my neighbor, it's more important to have proper nutrition, but somehow I have a genetics that make me a little more invulnerable, resistant to adverse effects of nutrition. What do you think of that? Have you seen any of that in the studies?
Yes, and that's a great question because I think it points to the future for functional medicine, which are individualized epigenetic profiles. And those are simply assays, and we're working on that. One of our research projects is working on that, looking at genetic profile, which is, if you think about it, it's like the blueprint of a house, a blood composition, which is what happens to that genetic profile in its expression in your blood chemistry. And thirdly, the microbiome or the intestinal tract, what happens when you're actually living in the house. And so when you have these three, then you get a high degree of specificity and you're able to answer questions like, what is most important for me? Is it diet? And which aspects of diet? Is it physical activity? And if so, exactly what kind of physical activity, what kind of stress management or meditation might in fact be most useful? I think and there are a number of companies that are now, maybe 7 or 8 of them, that are doing reasonably good epigenetic assays that answer questions down to the level of are eating walnuts better than eating almonds for your genetic profile. And you can determine that. And I think next 3 to 5 years, you'll see more of that, and we'll see a high degree of personalized epigenetic profiles that will answer questions about specificity. And yes, it's going to be different for every person, unequivocally. We're all different. Our biochemistries are all different. Our genetics are, in fact, all different. And therefore, what we need and what we get and how we interact is going to be different as well.
I'm going to look forward to that. I know some of us have more so-called interoception. We have more or less awareness of our body. And when we eat a particular food, is this good for me or not? I personally am sort of low on those scores of interoception. So something like you're describing that could provide more external guidance about foods and everything else. I'm going to look forward to that.
But yes,
So,
and there's, as an example, there's one company, and I don't have any proprietary interests. It's called Day2, and it's an Israeli-based company out of the Weizmann Institute, which is one of the world's most eminent nutritional research institutes. And it looks at glycemic index and spikes that are caused by foods. And so we know that glycemic index spikes will predispose to pre-diabetic conditions, but also to Alzheimer's and other inflammatory conditions. And they have a genetic profile that can literally tell you exactly which foods spike your insulin and which ones don't. And what's fascinating about it is sometimes foods that we don't think spike our insulin do, and things that we think would spike our insulin do not. So we're not, you're right, our ability to introspect about these subtle changes is limited. It's certainly a positive thing, but it's somewhat limited.
Yeah, indeed. So mind is healer, mind is slayer, mind is thoughts, and also in our minds we entertain feelings, which are closely related to thoughts. Certainly there's some interesting definitions around that, but I'd like to get your sense of feelings in this broader discussion and equation of what we're speaking about so far in healing.
Yeah, well, certainly what I found in the course of Sound Mind, Sound Body, where I looked at a number of individuals that had exceptional health status and exceptional achievement, they all had an emotionally rich life. And it was interesting because these were people who were known worldwide, David Rockefeller, Norman Cousins, and yet when you looked at their actual intimate connections, there were usually 2 or 3 people with whom they had quite intimate social connectivity, but it was critical for them to have that. And they also were capable of emotional expression with these intimate individuals. And when we look at emotional lability, the ability to access emotions, there's a direct correspondence between positive and negative emotions. Ironically, in the microbiome, we're beginning to see that changes in the intestinal tract brought on by stress, brought on by diet, by exercise, has a profound impact on mentation. So changes in the gut via the vagus nerve have a direct impact on the brain. Changes in the brain, ecstasy, happiness, joy, depression, anger, in turn have a direct negative impact on the body. So there's a reciprocal system, which says basically emotional expression, preferably in the positive, of course, has a profound impact on our health and well-being.
Yeah. This term emotional intelligence, I'm sure you've heard of it. Unfortunately, in our Western educational system, we emphasize more mental intelligence and not emotional, but I would advocate all of us to educate ourselves and raise up that intelligence, as you were saying, more on the emotion side, excuse me, more on the sides of the emotions. And also you were hinting at the value of social support, which you also mentioned regarding that one astronaut. Was it missing friends and family while he was up in the orbiter that he was missing here on Earth? And as you know, in the world of behavioral medicine, there's so much literature on the value and the need for social support. We are social beings after all, but to have a social support that's truly based on emotional intelligence, that's supportive of our well-being. I mentioned earlier the 7 pillars of health, and I mentioned one of those pillars, which was the detoxification. We spoke about glyphosate and so forth. Are there any other of those pillars you'd like to mention here, share with us that's relevant to this broad concept and science of healing?
Probably the one that has received the most attention is inflammation. And there's a tendency now to think inflammation is bad. And that's really not the case. Like all things in the immunity system, it's a matter of balance. It's not a matter of either or. So if we didn't have inflammation, we'd be susceptible to colds and flus, and minor injuries would not heal, and we'd be susceptible to infection. So inflammation is not inherently bad. But what we find is that our diets, our stress levels create excessive, prolonged levels of inflammation. And those excessive, prolonged levels have a really negative impact all the way from cardiovascular disease, creating inflammation around the heart and the vascular system, to the gastrointestinal tract with irritable bowel conditions, to arthritic disorders. When people who are under stress, their arthritis will flare, they have more pain, they have more difficulty moving. So inflammation is really a critical variable. And it's induced by the white diet, if you will, the white rice, the white potatoes, the refined foods, the processed meats. Those are all pro-inflammatory. And all of the things we think of as organic, cruciferous vegetables, rice and lentils, et cetera, all of those are anti-inflammatory. And again, it creates a balance for us. So inflammation is a critical variable, and one that we need to pay attention to. And it's easy. You can measure that. The CRP, C-reactive protein, is an easily measurable variable in the blood that can tell us, do we have a hyperactive immunity and hyperreactive inflammation, or is it within a normal range? So this is an easy one to measure, and it's a critical variable for our mental and physical health.
Excellent. And I'll add to that there's quite a bit of literature on the practice of meditation, and also the practice of yoga, the yoga postures, and also breathing, pranayama, that's favorable for inflammation in terms of bringing down inflammatory profiles when they're high. In fact, we wrote a research paper probably maybe 6 months ago when this whole SARS-CoV-2 was starting. It was a collaboration with some of my colleagues at the University of California, San Diego, also at MIT, and also Harvard. Deepak Chopra, Rudy Tanzi, and some other folks were part of the paper. And we did a summary of all the literature on meditation, yoga, and pranayama that is shown to oppose these cytokine storms of which this viral infection can induce. So we were advocating this as, yes, potentially other standard medical therapies are good, but just taking care of yourself through these practices would also be extremely helpful as an adjunctive therapy, either if you've contracted the virus already, or certainly just as a form of prophylactic, so to speak. Maybe we can get this paper posted on the Summit website and people could just download it and read it.
I hope so. And I know that paper, and I think it's excellent. Oh, yeah. I know you And I think it was an excellent contribution. I mean, cytokine storm is a hyperimmunity response.
Mm.
And when you look at the actual cause of death in most COVID patients, it's an exacerbation of a pre-existing condition or comorbidity, most of them being cardiovascular or lung problems. And the cytokine storm, the hyper response, an unchecked immune response that creates an overwhelming amount of cytokine activity, is inherently destructive to the human body and is the actual cause of death for the vast majority of people. So I think the introduction that you did of meditation as a mediating practice in this, in the COVID epidemic, it was a very valuable contribution. Absolutely.
Thank you for that feedback. So I want to take you back to a paper you published many, many years ago, and it has to do with the early days of the so-called alternative medicine movement. And I want to bring this up for a couple of reasons. And one of them has to do with ultimately getting your opinion of where does so-called, certainly integrative medicine stand these days, but really, where does the world of Western biomedicine stand as far as moving truly to a more holistic healing form of medicine? And I want to discuss that because many of us who are listening, yes, we follow more of the complementary integrative model, but sometimes we do need to go to a traditional medical system, and that can be extremely challenging depending on the particular physician and the medical model of that institution. Right. So the paper, if you might remember this one, the title is Life with the New Roommate, Alternative Medicine Moves In with Conventional Medicine. Do you remember that paper?
I do.
And that's a wonderful title. And that was the early days of when the alternative ideas and then later named complementary medicine started popping up in the biomedical model. And there's a lot of pushing and shoving, and it still exists today. But we have come fairly far. We have all these integrated medicine centers at major academic medical centers around the US, of course, including the Osher at UC San Francisco, where you are. And there's been slow inroads into standard practice of medicine in some hospitals. It's getting better, but I'd like to get your opinion of that and also advice you could offer to attendees of the summit, how to navigate some of this when something might happen to their own health, that they have to step into that environment, which can be very challenging, as you know.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I'm profoundly optimistic. I think medical jargon sort of guardedly optimistic about the future of integrative medicine. Mm-hmm. And like you, I'm a scientist, and I rely. Give you an example. The Cochrane Collaboration is an international group that evaluates research, and it's out of London, and it's named for the British epidemiologist Archie Cochrane. And a Cochrane Collaboration asks a very simple question: does intervention X for condition Y, does it work, yes or no, based on clinical case studies, randomized clinical trials, and all of the evidence that you can amass? And they farm this out all over the world to different research centers asking that question. And there were two interesting things the Cochrane Collaboration did. Is they took about 350 studies of conventional medicine only, not alternative medicine. And they looked at, of the Cochrane reviews, how would you break this down in terms of evidence for efficacy versus evidence of harm? So 6 categories. And what they found is that evidence of efficacy or possible efficacy was evident in only 30% of the conditions that they looked at. In 7 to 8% of the conditions, there was evidence of harm. So in other words, things that were being done day in and day out in conventional medicine actually had evidence of harm. Now and they published a subsequent study which confirmed that initial analysis. Now, that's not to condemn conventional medicine at all, but it certainly says we need to look at what is the basis for evidence that we introduce into our medical care system and providers. And if it's on an even footing, then many alternative therapies, acupuncture, dietary interventions, physical activity, meditation, have an excellent basis in science for efficacy. So the important thing is, how do we integrate these? When you look at what is best for the person, rather than if it's conventional or alternative, that's an artificial divide. When we ask what's best for the person and then unite the conventional. So if you have the necessity of a bypass procedure, what do you do beforehand in terms of stress management? What do you do afterwards in terms of dietary practices? What do you do for pain management using acupuncture? So that's a good example of a high-tech surgery combined with all of the alternative methods that lead to a better outcome for a person. So my optimism, and guarded optimism, is that in fact we are seeing more and more of that. I guess the last thing I would say is that the University of Arizona has the best training program in integrative medicine in the world, actually. And there are probably 2,200 physicians, almost all in the United States, that have trained for 2 years post-residency in integrative medicine. So if you are, and you can locate a practitioner by going onto their website, by specialty, by geographic location. And so if you have a physician that's just, or a clinician, I would say, who's just not amenable to this integration, which really makes sense, especially now at this point in time, you can go there and you can find practitioners. And I think more and more, we're able to identify individuals that on a science basis can integrate conventional with integrative or alternative medicine into an integrative medicine model. That to me is unequivocally the future of medicine. It really is. And I think that's important for people to realize. Yes. Last thing I would point out is there's an association of integrative medicine practitioners or schools. There are about 130 medical schools in the United States, and I think 70 schools belong to this academic consortium for integrative medicine. And they have to have a letter from the dean. They have to have research and clinical practices in integrative medicine to be a member. And that membership has grown. There are annual meetings. So this is a trajectory that I think is irreversible and very positive.
Thank you so much for that. What a valuable resource for everyone to have. And perhaps we could even post some of that information on the Summit website, the resources of these particular physicians. What you're saying is we have resources now. There are enough folks who have trained, there's enough scientific evidence to move that needle so that if we have to enter traditional biomedical care, we can do so while being surrounded with more of the true healing arts, the other things you mentioned, of course, meditation and acupuncture. And some of these centers I know also have hands-on healing therapists there too to help guide us through our own healing.
Absolutely.
You said that's basically the future of medicine, and that touches on what was going to be my final question for you. Not so much the future of medicine per se, although this is related, but what do you say is the future of healing? Very broadly, this is a summit on healing. All of us are continually seeking health and well-being on our mind, our body, our spiritual side. What's the future for us for healing? Whatever you'd like to share on that.
I'm so glad you asked that. I've always been more interested in health than disease, always. And to me, the future of healing has to do with the focus on health. What are the preconditions whereby people optimize optimal health, extended longevity? And that to me is so fascinating, because if you look at the dire predictions, you have an 80% chance of susceptible to condition X or Y. That means 20 or 30% do not. It means 20 or 30% are going to outlive that statistic, are going to move beyond that particular condition. The other is we have models all over the world. The blue zones, I think, is a fascinating area where everything we've been talking about this morning has to do and is represented in the blue zones, to do with diet, with physical activity, psychosocial, honoring the elderly. The people who are in their hundreds always have a role. They're never relegated to the status of useless. In fact, they usually make all the decisions for the family. They live in environmentally positive environments. They have adequate medical care. They don't get an MRI for tennis elbow, but if they have, an easily treatable antibiotic infection, they have access to that. So we're not eschewing good, appropriate primary care. It's critical. But we look at them as models. To me, that represents the future of healthcare, where we learn and understand the diets, the stress management techniques, the environmental factors, the connections we have with other people, the spiritual values that guide in the decisions that we make. All of these will lead us toward an optimal future, an economic well-being, racial and ethnic equality, recognizing that others who don't have as much as we might have an opportunity to express and get engaged moving toward this future. So I see a time when life expectancies will be in the hundreds, and the human body, if we look at the biological ability of the human body, our bodies are made to last about 100 to 125 years. That's known as the Hayflick limit in terms of cellular replication. Cells are made to replicate roughly the equivalent of 120 to 125 years. I think that's entirely possible. And these are good years. I think last thing I would say is that we have such a phobia about death and the end of life, that what you find in these cultures, they do not fear death in the long-lived cultures, the blue zones. If they're 115 to 120, they normally die very rapidly. Within 2 or 3 days, they'll say to someone, let's celebrate this weekend, I won't be with you on Monday. So they know when their time has come. They do not have long, lingering periods of morbidity. They do not live in impaired health. They live in optimal health. It's called squaring the curve. You live until you die. Mm-hmm. And that's what I see as a future. And I really think we're going to get there. Again, it's sort of a naive optimism, perhaps. But like you, I really believe that is our destiny, to have optimal health, optimal longevity, and we have the means and understanding to do it.
Ken, incredible vision. Thank you. That is the perfect note to end our interview for the summit. Thank you very much for all your insights, your wisdom, and your time.
Same. Thank you. This is a real pleasure.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Take care.